Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios, and today's video may just be the single most requested piece of content that I've ever made on this channel. So a few videos back, I did a review of the Fortin Nameless VST plugin, many days late compared to other YouTubers, but within a couple hours, I got multiple comments on that video, on future videos, on live streams of people asking me, please do an AX8 tone match of the Fortin Nameless. So that's exactly what we're doing today. And I'd initially planned to make this a smaller section of a couple later videos that I will still get to. But once I started getting into the actual work of making the patch, I realized this absolutely deserves its own video. And I'll be kind of explaining a little bit more of my process versus some of the other tone matches, kind of the same way I did with Meshuggah, which is funny considering that it has so much Fortin sound in their tone. And then the other videos that I plan to get to down the road will have a little bit different parts emphasized compared to what I planned on with this section. So it all works out in the end. So good suggestion, appreciate the feedback there. So if you normally just tune out this part of the video or skip around to the walkthrough section, totally understand, feel free to do so. But for those of you that are at all interested in how I go about this kind of stuff, I'll be talking just a little bit about how I systematically tried to tone match each portion of the Fortin Nameless plugin. Again, if you want to skip ahead, that's fine, but hopefully I saved everyone $100. You're welcome. Took one for the team there. So there's three portions of the Fortin Nameless plugin that make it so incredible. You've got the grind pedal, you have the Meshuggah 50-watt amplifier sim itself, which is unnamed, hence nameless, and then you have a very respectable cabinet and microphone simulation. So starting with the grind pedal, having owned both the physical grind and Fortin 33 pedal, I'm pretty familiar with their sound, and I know for an absolute fact they are basically glorified clean boost. They don't have any silicon diode clipping. They're not doing anything funny with gain staging. They really are just boosting your guitar signal and carving out different frequencies. The question was always, well, what frequencies are we talking about? Early on, I made a video on the AX8 on how to get kind of the Fortin grind sound, and I think it was pretty close, all things considered. I ended up using the drive block for it, and works very well. It's got that high frequency bite. It scoops out the lows, and I still use a very similar curve and setup on that drive pedal today on many patches. Then, friend of the channel, Roman Arcefus, actually did some frequency analysis of my Fortin 33, and hopefully we'll actually be doing a little bit more in detail here soon on a future video, and gave me some numbers based on kind of like point to point of what the frequency curve looked like. Unfortunately, I never actually solved the curve itself. I don't know why I didn't think to ask for it. So I was still approximating in videos like the Meshuggah patch. Well, today I said, you know what, screw that. I'm gonna do a little bit of legwork and get the actual curve. And here it is. This is basically the Fortin grind curve. We've got a low carve, which is kind of what I've always been doing. Kind of a straight line up, well, straight line in a logarithmic term, up to the 950 hertz region, and then we kind of take a little bit of a scoop and a shelf and falls off after 10,000 hertz because there's nothing there in terms of frequency on a guitar. So I was pretty close with a couple different nuanced sections that I didn't quite pick up on, but copying that curve in a couple different ways on the AX8 produced great results. And they're a little different, very subtle, but both very good. So I included them both, and I'll let you choose and tweak depending on the sound you're going for. because you can deactivate individual components on the Fortin plugin, I was actually able to validate this curve by disabling the grind pedal, running this curve on my AX8, a DI out into the rest of the plugin, and it sounded basically identical between my AX8 approximation and the grind that's built in on the plugin itself. So, and I'm actually able to do that on all three sections. So once I got that part good, the next stop was the amplifier, and this was without a doubt the hardest thing to match, which is kind of what we're all trying to match, right? I mean, you got a $100 plugin that does a really great job of approximating a $3,300 amp head that is limited to less than 100, I think. I don't know exactly how many were made, but you can't order them anymore. They're out of stock, and the last batch was made in July, if I remember correctly. So they're kind of gone. Fortunately, a little knowledge about the basic design of the Meshuggah Signature and some good old-fashioned A/B testing got me pretty much all the way there. So the interesting thing about the Meshuggah Sig is that it's very much like all other Mike Fortin creations, is that it's more or less a hot rodded Marshall from hell. In this instance, it's single channel, 50 watt, 12 AX7 preamp tubes, EL34 power tubes, which is a bit of a departure from a lot of the 6L6 based power amp sounds that Meshuggah used in the past. In this case, instead of using the high, low frequency and overall gain controls that you can see on stuff like the Fortin Nameless, a lot of the Randall designs, in this case we actually have a gain 1, which is your overall gain, and gain 2 is almost like a built-in grind pedal that does the contouring of the gain. You got a pull gain on the master volume to add more gain, because of course, why not? So with that, because it is very heavily based off of a Marshall, the tone stack is basically entirely Marshall, EL34 power amp sound, it gives us a good place to start. And well, the closest things that are in the Axe8 firmware to a Fortin modded Marshall are really two different models. You have Splawn, which are great amps, and you also have Friedman. And I ended up landing on an unusual model of Friedman that was actually, if I remember correctly, added in the latest firmware, which is kind of cool. I wasn't getting the sounds I wanted out of the 100 watt models that I really enjoy otherwise, which was an interesting revelation. So quite a bit of tweaking, a little bit of playing around with the power section as well as resonant frequencies, a little bit of in the loop EQing. I think it sounds pretty damn good. After I validated this raw amp sound by going through the plugins cabinet simulation, it was time to tackle those speakers. And this was no small feat either, because according to the man himself in charge of creating the impulse responses for this plugin, absolutely outstanding job by the way, these sound phenomenal. These speakers were actually Mesa Vintage 30 70 watts, and it totally makes sense why I love these things, because they're kind of a holy grail for a lot of heavy metal. But I ended up blending 60 watt vintage 30s with 75 watt T75s all the time, and the frequencies kind of complement each other, not to mention the power rating, to create a very similar sound to the 70 watt V30s. So no shit, I like it a lot, and which is why you kind of get the instantaneous Meshuggah sound, even though they tend to favor T75. So thing is, according to my research, there's no 70 watt V30s in the impulse response list that comes with the AX8. At least they're not called out as such, if so. However, I fell back on my tried and true method of blending complementary impulse responses. I think we got some really good results out of it. So frankly speaking, I am more proud of the individual results of each component. I think the grind versus the grind, or the amp versus the amp, the cab versus the cab sound better than the end result, because all those little errors eventually accumulate and you get something in the end product that just sounds a little different. but it's good different. And I think that if you take two mass-produced amps off the street and a bunch of mass-produced pedals, mass-produced, cabinets, they might sound more different than the AX8 versus Fortin Nameless does in this scenario. So a little bit of tweaking here and there, and you could probably get a little bit closer, but I'm very happy with the results. And with that, let's take a quick tour of the patch itself. Starting on our first rhythm scene here, you'll notice a couple things right off the bat. Firstly, yes, this title is a reference to Dark Souls because I'm a fucking dork. The first block that's activated in the signal chain here is a PEQ. So here we are basically mimicking the grind pedal as we talked about earlier. And these are the settings. It's not an exact like for like of at least the smooth curve that I obtained through EQ matching. But it sounds pretty much dead on. It took a lot of tweaking in this lower cutoff frequency, as well as the Q value to get it just right, to get enough body in the bottom end of the guitar without being too boomy and inarticulate. So that's what the PEQ ends up looking like for the parametric block. But I also included a graphic EQ representation of it, and I've recorded the demos with this. It's six in one hand, half dozen the other. Very, very close either way. I did this partially so those of you who have, say, a 10-band EQ, even an 8-band, you can get pretty close. You can basically mimic that curve and get really, really spot on the grind sound. So you can see it does the same general thing. So you can use whichever one. I find this one's a bit more glassy sounding. It's not quite as round in the mids. I don't know how to put that any better way. But it is so very subtle that if I didn't tell you one way or another, you probably wouldn't have even noticed. So these two are basically your grind pedals. And honestly, when I get the EQ match results back for the 33, I may just make one of these and do it in parallel and that kind of stuff. So that ought to be pretty cool. We've got a basic noise gate between the quote-unquote grind pedal and our amp. The amp is the star of the show here. So this is a fairly new Friedman model, the Brown Eye C45. This was added in Quantum 10 firmware. And this is basically like any other Friedman BE model. It's not the higher gain HBE. The difference here is that it has the C45 on it, which means that it is actually a treble boost on the input. Now imagine that's like a capacitor with, I don't know, I don't think that would be a 45 picofarad. I was thinking 450, but maybe it is 45. Either way, it's going to add some upper frequency content. And it makes perfect sense why this worked better than the regular BEs because of that second gain control that's on the actual amp. And that's adding some of that high frequency we were talking about earlier. So that's what we're going to use to approximate the gain 2 control, even though we only have one gain. EQing it was a bit of a challenge, but I feel like it got pretty close. It does the typical Marshall thing where you have to put the bass at 10. And even in this case, I rolled the depth all the way up to 10. You can back this off to make it work better in some mixes, but for extended range guitars, even paired with a bass guitar, it works really well. I find it has the kind of the body of Mesa Boogie and 5150s, that kind of stuff. So it plays nice in those fields. Treble's not too far high. Presence, a little shy of 3 o'clock. Do have the bright switch on. Master volume is the hard thing to tame here. This is where you're going to want to play around to see how much mids come out. I left it below the noon position because I found that anywhere around there or further, it kind of sounds too classic, not scooped enough. It's a little hairy, if that makes sense. And where I'm actually using the pull gain control on the amp and all the comparisons on the Fortin, that is, then it makes more sense to leave this below noon. So the 3.5 to 4 range sounds pretty good. The only other thing I played with here was the saturation drive. It sounds fine off, but I feel like when you do the pull gain on the Fortin amp, it does add a little bit of saturation in the gain to where it did need
some of this drive. Ideal sounds a little too robotic, and the default of 4 was a little too much as well, so I put it down to 2.2. Little bit of graphic EQing, which I combined with this to tweak it a little bit further, and ended up using the same. We got a 10 band here, but we got an 8 band here. That's basically doing very, very similar stuff. Preamp, I think I changed the preamp tubes from JJ's just to the standard model. It's not all that different. The only difference is the hardness. You can play with those as you see fit. I don't really think that's too critical of a parameter. Power amp, I don't think I touched anything here. As you see, we're still using EL34s. Power supply, I might have turned the sag down just a hair, but again, not a critical value. Here is one thing I did change. The default speaker resonance, if you double click, goes to 90, which sounds really good and sounds very tight, but it just didn't have the low end presence, that boominess that the model, the VST model has. So I settled in on 107. I think it sounds pretty good. That's probably pretty close to the resonant frequency of the V30 70 watt, but by the time you put that in a cabinet, it's going to change, that kind of stuff. So still works well. You can bump it up if you feel it needs some more presence in the low 100 hertz region. Added a little bit of speaker drive. Everything else stayed the same because these Friedman models are freaking great. I keep coming back to them over and over for my high gain Marshall sounds. So GEQ, as we showed earlier, the cabinets. This one was a bitch to tell you the truth. I ended up settling on a mix between the V30 Uber Cab, which I always go to the V30's T75 combos as like a starting point for heavy metal stuff, and this 4x12 Cali, which I'm assuming is an original Mesa Boogie. I don't know what they're using. Could be regular vintage 30s as well, but the micing's pretty bright. And combining the two, it gets a very, very similar result to what you hear in the plugin. So I'm happy enough with it. I also included a different cabinet combination with a sorcerer here, but I'm really only using this for a couple scenes. I feel like this gets you closer. And honestly, I said kind of facetiously at the beginning, I hope to save you $100 on this. But if you really want this to come alive, spend a few bucks. I don't know how much a lot of impulse response packs are running nowadays, but if you can find something with that 70 watt Mesa or like the Own Hammer Friedman stuff's amazing sounding, and pair it with this, you're going to get results that are rivaling the Nameless plugin. So highly recommend that if you're really, really into different impulse responses. So let's give this one a spin real quick. And for posterity, I'll go ahead and do a quick comparison with the graphic EQ representation. As you'll hear, not a whole lot of difference. Side by side, I think I do prefer the GEQ, but I don't know how much of that is in my head, to tell you the truth. So going up here to scene 5, same thing. We just got the X cabinet selected instead of Y. On scene 2, I actually am using a second amp model because we had a lot of CPU space to play with when I initially was making this. So I said, yeah, screw it, why not? So this is actually the jumpered 50 watt plexi model. So this is like a, your old lower gain Marshall Super Lead type head, but this would be simulating the Fortin Meshuggah on a lower gain setting. I got pretty close results to this, but this, I just thought we had processing power left over. Might as well throw you a bone and give you a bit of a clean channel if you're into that kind of Marshall stuff. This one is more of your straightforward sound. We got a reverb as well. And then on scene 6, it's the same thing with some chorus delay and reverb for some spaciness. We're back to our Freeman on scene 3, except I have this volume pan over here at negative 28 decibels. That's a lot, except it's a really high gain head. So what I'm trying to do here is kind of a higher gain version of the clean thing. There's some instances where I could see you'd want to, like, you're rolling off your volume, except this does it automatically for you. So kind of does this sort of sound. And the last non-utility scene is 7. This is kind of a lead thing. I'm using, instead of the grind pedal, a tube screamer, and then chorus and delay. Just thought I'd throw it in here. The Fortin stuff isn't what I would normally view as a lead compatible gear, but it could definitely do it. Just with that, when you take out everything below like 300 hertz on your guitar, you can't really expect it to hang very well, at least not sound shrill and nasally on the higher strings. So that's why I'm replacing the drive pedal in this case, but still get really great results with the amp, as you would expect. Scenes 4 and 8 are really for recording purposes only, but I threw them in here to kind of show how I went about this. So this is the amp and pedal signal only with no cabinet. So if you also have the Fortin Nameless, or perhaps you just have some other software, say like the 2 Notes Torpedo Wall of Sound that have some good cabinet sounds you want, you can use this without the built-in cab sim and just monitor within whatever software you're using. This is basically how I tweaked the amp sound and going through the Nameless speaker simulation. So that's all 4 is. And then scene 8, straight DI. I've used these two to switch back and forth between the plugin itself and this patch to dial it in real time. So on the floorboard, all you're going to see is scenes 1 through 1, 2, 3, and 5, 6, 7. These two will be omitted because if you're recording, you're going to have this up anyway, more than likely. So that's pretty much it for the patch itself. It's pretty lean, but very mean, and I'm pretty proud of this one. I got to tell you, it took quite a bit of time, but I think the results are worth it, and definitely comforting to know that I can take the Fortin Meshuggah sound with me practically anywhere and plug it in anywhere and get some really, really sweet results. And, it cost me a little bit of money for the plug-in. Still love it. We'll definitely keep using it, but it saved me like $3,200 on another amp head, so appreciate that. So that'll be all. Thanks for watching, and we will see you hopefully sooner rather than later with another tone match video. Bye.